History remembers the kings, but some women shaped empires with more force than any man. A pharaoh who took the throne, a queen who challenged Rome, a ruler who held an island together. Their power was real, their impact was massive. These are the women who ruled empires.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a massive swing through history, looking at a phenomenon that has always been rare, often radical, and eternally compelling: women who held the reins of power.
Exactly. We're talking about the queens, the empresses, the pharaohs, the women who really dictated the fate of nations.
But this isn't just a list of famous names, it's an analysis of the sheer ingenuity required to hold power in systems that were, let's be honest, explicitly designed to exclude them.
That's absolutely right. Our mission today is to dive deep into the sources that track the legacy, the immense, almost crippling challenges, and perhaps most fascinatingly, the completely different strategies employed by history's most famous female rulers.
And we're covering a huge amount of ground here.
We are. We are spanning thousands of years, from ancient Egyptian temples all the way up to 18th century European palaces, asking, what price do these women actually pay for governance?
And the scope of this mission is immediately framed by the data. When you look at the entirety of recorded history, we're talking the last 5 millennia of codified leadership, the scarcity of women in power is immediately apparent.
It's stark, really.
We found that only about 500 names of female rulers are even documented. 500 in 5,000 years.
It's an astoundingly low figure when you consider the time frame. You contrast that sharply with the men who ruled during the same period, and their numbers explode into the tens of thousands. It's not even comparable.
So why? What does that tell us?
It tells us that the default setting of history is male succession and leadership. Female rule is, statistically speaking, an anomaly. It's an exception that usually requires a crisis, like a succession failure, or of a very specific legal loophole to even occur.
But the sources immediately clarify that low formal numbers don't mean zero influence. I think we have to introduce the nuance of power right at the start.
Yes. That is so important. Women did generate political power, often by ruling as part of a pair.
A pair? What do you mean by that?
Well, if you look at the ancient Orient, for instance, or particularly the Hellenistic dynasties, the successor states that sprang up after Alexander the Great fractured his massive empire rule was frequently a diarchy.
A diarchy, so ruled by two people.
Exactly, exercised by a king and a queen. So even if a woman couldn't formally take the title of sole sovereign ruler, she could generate significant political power because she was ruling alongside a son, a brother, or a husband.
Okay, so this sounds like a system of co-regency where she acted as an engine of power, even if she wasn't technically listed as the driver. What kind of political power did they actually wield in these pairs?
Oh, immense power. Often they controlled vast familial wealth, which is political power in itself. They influenced religious rituals, which were central to the state's legitimacy, and most critically, they ensured legitimacy in succession.
How so?
In the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, for example, the role of the queen was structurally important to the point that it was expected. A king simply couldn't rule without a queen. While the king was the formal head, the queen was frequently depicted on temples and coins, making decrees, sometimes even raising her own troops.
So she's not just a ceremonial figure.
Not at all. This framework is absolutely crucial because it means that even when a woman takes sole power later on, she often learned the mechanism of governance while sharing the steering wheel, so to speak.
So the lesson is that the path to independent female rule was often paved by acting as an indispensable partner first.
Precisely. And that allows us to understand the first great wave of female leaders that we are diving into today.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are going to explore how figures like Hatshepsut, Cleopatra, Zenobia, Elizabeth I, and Maria Theresa navigated this extremely rare position and what completely different playbook each one used to survive.
And they are wildly different playbooks.
To begin, we head straight to the Nile. Ancient Egypt is the source of the most famous early female regents spanning many, many dynasties, and our sources highlight that the most prominent women from that era all had a man by their side, initially, a son, a brother, or a husband.
They absolutely did. That was the entry point. But the key takeaway here, and the sources are very clear on this, is that they universally demonstrated that they were equally capable in their role as their male counterparts.
This was not a passive role, then.
Not in the slightest. These women were active co-regents or regents for minor sons, and they proved that they possessed that's the spiritual and political power necessary to uphold the state. They weren't just keeping the throne warm.
And no one took that proof to a more extreme, more radical conclusion than Hatshepsut. She is, I think, rightly considered the most powerful woman on the Nile, and her story is just a masterpiece of political transformation.
Her actions were utterly unprecedented in Egyptian history. She started her career in a very traditional way as the great royal wife of Pharaoh Thutmose II. After his death, she became regent for her stepson, the very young Thutmose III.
Which was a standard role for a queen mother.
A standard, powerful role. But she wasn't content with it. She took the ultimate step. She proclaimed herself pharaoh.
That is an immense and, frankly, a shattering political move. Pharaoh wasn't just a title, it was a religious role, a divine manifestation of the gods Horus and Ra on earth. How did she rationalize going from queen, a powerful but inherently secondary role, to pharaoh, the king?
Well, she used every tool at her disposal. She relied heavily on propaganda, commissioning reliefs and inscriptions that told the story of her own divine birth, claiming the direct blessing of the god Amun-Ra.
So she rewrote her own origin story.
Essentially, yes. But crucially, she had to reconcile the fact that the pharaoh's role, politically and cosmologically, was masculine. The king had to perform certain rituals tied to male physicality, embodying the strong, enduring rule necessary to maintain divine order. A queen could not easily fulfill this.
This brings us to the astonishing detail that speaks volumes about the gendered expectations of power and the necessity of performance. When she transitioned from queen to king, she had to radically change her public presentation.
Radically is the right word. She had to eliminate the perceived weakness of female rule by adopting the visual and political identity of a male monarch. This is where the physical transformation comes in. And it's fascinating. She wasn't just, wearing different clothes. She was altering her very representation of divinity and authority.
She presented herself on the throne and in statuary as a man.
Yes.
And to drive that point home, to signal to the priests, the court, and the people that she was fulfilling the male cosmic duties of the pharaoh, she adopted the specific symbols of male authority.
That's right. She adopted the ceremonial beard, which wasn't real hair, of course, but a false beard, a symbol of authority attached to the chin, and remarkably, the codpiece, or as the source calls it, the Hodenschutz.
Codpiece, that's a very specific choice.
It's a very specific and very powerful choice. The sources stress this was not about fashion or vanity. This was a calculated political move. She was using her body, or rather the representation of her body, as a political argument.
Why was the codpiece or the Hodenschutz so critical in this context?
Because it was a symbol of strength, of virility, of vitality, all things necessary for a ruler who is literally tasked with ensuring the fertility of the land and the endurance of the state. By adopting these symbols, she was visually and physically declaring, my political identity is now the state, and the state must be perceived as strong and masculine for divine order to prevail.
So she effectively replaced her natural body with a necessary political body representation.
Exactly. She had to ensure stability. It's a brutal, self-denying act of political theater. She erased her natural gender identity to succeed within a rigid, patriarchal power structure that equated governance with male biology.
And crucially, her strategy worked.
It did, spectacularly. Her reign was one of immense prosperity. She didn't achieve her legacy through military conquest, which often defines male pharaohs, but through immense building projects, like her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, and major trade expeditions, like the famous voyage to the land of Punt.
So she was a builder, not a conqueror.
Precisely. She demonstrated competence, but she had to dress that competence in masculine clothes. And the irony is that after her death, her stepson, Thutmose III, when he finally came to power, attempted to erase her image from history.
Did what?
He had many of her statues smashed, her name chiseled out of cartouches. He tried to write her out of the king lists.
Wow. A clear sign that even successful female rule was seen as a dangerous precedent that needed to be politically scrubbed from the record.
It was a violation of ma'at, of the natural order, that needed correcting in the historical record, even if her reign was peaceful and prosperous.
Okay, now let's pivot to a ruler who took the complete opposite path, Cleopatra VII. Instead of erasing her femininity, she leveraged it.
Absolutely. Cleopatra's a whole different story. She recognized the changing political tides. By the time she came to power, Egypt was under the crushing shadow of the Roman Empire.
It was a client state, basically.
Exactly. Unlike Hatshepsut's Egypt, which was internally secure, Cleopatra's nation faced imminent absorption. Military resistance was not a long-term viable option against the Roman legions. Her strategy had to be one of strategic politics, intellectual leverage, and charisma.
And she famously became the beloved of the two most powerful Romans of her era, first Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony. It's often simplified in popular history as mere seduction.
And that is a vast, vast disservice to her intellect. The sources stress she possessed not just immense charisma and Australung, this radiant presence, but deep intellect and political acumen, which the sources call Verstand.
So what does that mean in practice?
It means she spoke, reportedly, 9 languages. It means she was a mathematician, a philosopher, an author. When she met Caesar, she didn't just present herself as an exotic beauty. She presented herself as a political equal who understood Roman law and strategy better than many of Caesar's own advisors. She could debate with him on his own terms.
So she was using intellectual dominance as a tool of political survival. What specific diplomatic actions demonstrate this firsthand?
Well, consider her actions after the Alexandrian War, following Caesar's intervention. The Ptolemaic dynasty was constantly embroiled in civil war among her siblings. She stabilized it. She ensured Egypt retained its autonomy, even though it was effectively a client state of Rome.
And that was a major achievement.
A massive achievement. Her far-sighted diplomacy actually brought her country temporary new prosperity. She leveraged her personal relationships to pull every available lever tax exemptions, territorial grants, grain deals to reduce the crushing pressure Rome placed on her country. She was playing a very weak hand very, very skillfully.
Her final chapter is, of course, dominated by Mark Antony. The sources suggest this was a truly genuine, loving relationship.
They do. It seems to have been a real partnership, both personal and political. But it became a huge political liability once Octavian consolidated power in Rome.
Why is that?
Because their shared vision of a Hellenistic empire, ruled from Alexandria, was a direct ideological challenge to Octavian's vision of a purely Roman, Western-centric empire. He used it as propaganda, painting Antony as a man bewitched by a foreign queen, abandoning his Roman heritage.
And once they were defeated at the Battle of Actium, the fate of both Antony and Cleopatra was sealed.
It was. The end was inevitable.
And that leads us to the enduring mystery of her death. The traditional narrative, cemented by Roman propaganda, is the dramatic suicide by asp.
Yes. The story everyone knows. Antony falls on his own sword and she follows suit, choosing a dramatic, symbolic death over the humiliation of walking in chains behind Octavian's triumphal chariot in Rome.
But the sources we reviewed suggest modern research is questioning this neat ending.
They are, and for good reason.
What specifically leads researchers to doubt the suicide narrative?
Several things. First, the asp theory is highly improbable. Asp bites are slow, messy, and extremely painful. It's not the clean, swift exit you'd expect. A queen choosing her own death, with access to all sorts of royal poisons, would likely choose something much more reliable and dignified.
Okay, so the method is suspect. What else?
The political convenience for Octavian is just immense. If he had publicly executed her, it would have created a martyr and could have sparked revolts in Egypt. But if she died by her own hand, it validates his victory narrative, that she was a desperate, emotional foreign queen who couldn't face defeat. It's the perfect ending for his propaganda.
So many researchers now believe a contract killing, Auftragsmord, mord, is more probable, orchestrated by Octavian or his agents.
It just fits the political context perfectly. Octavian needed her gone, and he needed the narrative to look like suicide to avoid any repercussions. He gets to take Egypt's treasury without making her a hero.
Regardless of the exact method, the sources are clear on the outcome.
Yes. With her death, a full-blooded politician, Volblut-Politikerin, was lost. It was the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the end of Egyptian independence, definitively merging a 3,000-year civilization into the growing Roman Empire.
What a contrast we see here. Hatshepsut survived by becoming symbolically male, transforming her identity. Cleopatra leveraged her female identity, her intellect, and her political skill, but ultimately failed because the geopolitical forces arrayed against her were simply too vast.
Two brilliant women, two completely different approaches to very different outcomes.
Now we make a geographical and thematic shift. We are moving from the Mediterranean world to the sands of the Middle East and the city of Palmyra, transitioning to a different kind of warrior queen. Zenobia. She presented the Roman Empire with a military and existential challenge they truly hadn't anticipated.
Right. We've jumped forward over 300 years to around 270 AD. And the setting is crucial here. This is a period in Roman history known as the crisis of the 3rd century.
What was happening during that crisis?
Basically, the Roman Empire was internally collapsing. It was suffering from massive inflation, constant civil wars, leadership instability. They had something like 26 emperors in 50 years, the so-called barracks emperors.
So the central authority was incredibly weak.
Incredibly weak.
Right.
They had huge external pressure, busy fighting the Germans on its northern borders. Imperial weakness created opportunity.
And Zenobia saw that opportunity in spades. Palmyra was a crucial, immensely wealthy trade hub, a bridge between the Roman West and the Persian East.
It was one of the richest cities in the empire. And when her husband, the regent Odenathus, died, this ambitious woman seized power immediately. She didn't just settle for being a regent for her minor son.
No, she went for the ultimate defiant title.
She did. She consolidated power and formally declared herself Augusta Kaiserin, Empress. This was not an internal title for Palmyra. This was a direct, formal challenge to Rome's imperial authority. It was a declaration of succession to the entire Roman world.
That is an incredibly aggressive escalation. Rome considered itself the only source of imperial authority. To call yourself Augusta.
Precisely. And her defiance was visible. It was a massive act of propaganda of power designed to legitimize her rule internally and project authority externally. She had her portrait minted on coins.
Just like a Roman emperor.
Exactly. A move reserved only for the ruling Roman emperors. This act alone, the sources state, made Rome boil with fury because it implied she was creating a legitimate separate empire in the East.
What's fascinating here is that unlike Hatshepsut, who adopted male iconography to rule, or Cleopatra, who relied on diplomacy, Zenobia's response to Roman fury was pure military force. She was a genuine warrior queen who expanded her territory, and she did it rapidly.
Her strategy was pure expansion and resource control. She understood that in a time of Roman weakness, the only language the legions would respect was strength.
Let's detail the extent of her territorial control, because this is the so-what moment for Rome. Her expansion became an existential threat to the empire itself.
Absolutely. Initially, she consolidated her control over Syria, which was a very rich and prosperous province. That gave her immense wealth from trade tariffs to fund her legions. But then she expanded east into Egypt in 270 AD.
And that was the strategic masterstroke.
It was. It truly threatened the stability and existence of the Roman West.
Because Egypt was not just another province, it was the engine room of the empire.
Correct. Egypt was the breadbasket of the empire, famously called the jewel of the Roman Empire. By seizing control of Egypt, Zenobia effectively cut Rome off from its vital grain supply.
And what would that mean, practically?
It meant she could literally starve Rome, both literally and politically. A hungry Roman populace was a politically volatile populace. It led to riots and instability. Control of the grain routes meant she could fundamentally change the balance of power.
And her expansion didn't stop there. She also pushed north towards Asia Minor, threatening the rest of Rome's eastern holdings. How far did this Palmyrene Empire stretch at its peak?
At its height, the Palmyrene Empire under Zenobia stretched from the eastern Mediterranean coast across modern-day Syria and the Levant and deep into North Africa, including vital parts of Egypt. She was effectively challenging the entirety of Roman rule east of the Aegean.
So she wasn't just leading a regional revolt?
Not at all. She was trying to carve out a massive new Eastern empire at Rome's expense, taking full advantage of the weakness in the central power structure.
She forced Rome to respond, and they sent one of their great soldier emperors, Aurelian, to finally halt her advance. What was the nature of that confrontation?
Aurelian was known as Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world, and his campaign against Zenobia was his defining moment. Zenobia's forces met the Roman legions in major battles, notably at Imai and Emesa.
And she was on the battlefield.
She was. The sources say she led her troops, reportedly riding into battle on horseback alongside her generals. Despite her tactical skill and the bravery of her army, which was a mix of Palmyrene archers and heavy cavalry, the superior organization and experience of Aurelian's forces eventually prevailed. She was forced to retreat back to Palmyra.
And the sources mention the famous dramatic tale attached to Zenobia's defeat in 272 AD.
Yes, the legend of her capture. Aurelian besieged Palmyra. When the city eventually fell, Zenobia was captured while trying to escape to Persia. The legend, which was fueled by Roman historical accounts, states that Aurelian brought her back to Rome in chains.
Not just any chains, though.
No, gold chains, to signify her imperial status. She was made the centerpiece of his magnificent triumphal procession through the streets of Rome.
But the source notes that while this narrative is famous, it's not definitively proven historically.
That's right. There are debates among historians. Some sources say she died shortly after capture, either from illness or by her own hand. Others suggest she was treated well and lived out her days peacefully in a Roman villa, with her children marrying into the Roman aristocracy. We don't know for sure.
Whether she was led in chains or not, her final legacy is undeniable.
She remains an exceptional figure, a fierce and highly effective military fighter who directly challenged the absolute dominance of the Roman Empire at its moment of greatest weakness. She understood that power meant control over territory and vital resources, and she was willing to fight for it.
A dramatic departure from the political maneuvering of her Egyptian predecessors.
Completely, she dared to put her face on a coin and declare herself empress, forcing Rome to fight a war to literally restore its map.
We are going to jump now across a gulf of over 1,000 years to examine the great female monarchs of European history, the Tudor and Habsburg queens. And before we get into Elizabeth I, we have to pause on that huge chronological gap.
That gap is a deep dive in itself, really. Why don't we see women ruling in their own right in Europe between the fall of the Roman Empire and, say, the late Middle Ages or the early modern era?
Right, there's this huge void.
It's largely due to the rise of feudalism and strict primogeniture laws, particularly Salic law in places like France, which explicitly forbade female succession.
Primogeniture, the rule that the firstborn son inherits, that cemented masculine direct line succession, it often excluded women entirely from inheriting titles and land, let alone crowns.
Exactly. The focus shifted heavily onto the male line to prevent the fragmentation of holdings through marriage. When we do see powerful women in this period, they are almost always regents for their sons, like Blanche of Castile or the occasional exception in a place like Spain. But they were fighting against a legal structure that made their rule highly contested and often temporary.
So it took specific crises.
It did. It took crises like the extinction of a male line or revolutionary new legal decrees to allow a woman to finally break through and rule in her own name.
And that context sets the stage perfectly for Elizabeth I. Her very existence as queen was due to the complex political chaos of the English Reformation and the extinction of the male Tudor line after her brother Edward and sister Mary. Her reign, of course, marks the golden era of England.
Her rule was transformative. She built England into a dominant naval power, which led to the defeat of the Spanish Armada. She achieved a necessary and fragile peace with France. And very importantly, she skillfully managed the dangerous internal conflicts between Catholics and Protestants that had previously led to bloodshed and instability under her half-sister Mary I.
She created the Elizabethan settlement, a sort of middle way for the Church of England.
She did. But her biggest challenge, the same challenge that faced Hatshepsut centuries before, was the perception of her gendered rule in a system built on masculine authority.
And this is where we see the intense intellectual sophistication of her court and her own political mind. The sources highlight that right at the start of her reign, she explicitly referenced a concept from medieval political theory.
Yes, the distinction between the king's natural body and the political body.
Can you explain that concept? It's a bit abstract.
It is. The idea of the king's two bodies was that the king has a physical, mortal body, his natural body, which is subject to time, frailty, illness, and death. But he also has a political body, which is the enduring, immortal masculine state or crown. The physical king might die, but the crown lives on.
And this was traditionally used to explain how the king's personal failings didn't compromise the eternal nature of the crown. But Elizabeth repurposed it. How did she use it to explain her own female governance?
She used it as a shield, as armor. She needed to reassure her subjects and her parliament that her personal, natural body, the body of a woman, would not compromise the enduring, masculine, strong political body of the crown.
This is where that famous speech comes from.
The famous speech to her troops at Tilbury? Yes. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England, too. She was making the separation explicit. The political body was ruling, not the physical one.
This shows she was intensely, almost obsessively aware of the unique vulnerability of being a female monarch. She needed to present herself as the embodiment of stability, even while being physically a weak and feeble woman, as she put it.
And this necessity profoundly shaped her presentation. The sources note that her rule did not carry a distinctly female signature. She relied heavily on male ministers like William Cecil. She emphasized the classical, enduring nature of the crown in her portraits. She essentially tried to neutralize her own gender as a political factor.
Her awareness of gender became absolutely central to her personal life and political identity, specifically regarding the question of marriage. This is where her famous nickname comes from.
The Virgin Queen. She was courted intensely by every major prince and nobleman in Europe, Philip II of Spain, French princes, Swedish kings. The list is long.
And she famously avoided serious commitment, acting, as the sources put it, like a teenager. And backfish when it came to serious suitors.
It was a very calculated performance. She never married, adopting the iconic title of the Virgin Queen.
Why was spinsterhood a political necessity for her? It seems counterintuitive for a monarch who needs an heir.
Because if she married a foreigner, England risked being drawn into continental wars or becoming a vassal state. If she married an Englishman, it would create massive factionalism and jealousy at court. But most importantly, her power would legally transfer or at least be severely diminished by a king consort.
So she would lose control.
English law and political custom would have elevated her husband to co-ruler, and she would have lost absolute political control. By remaining unmarried, she maintained personal autonomy, and she kept every major European power guessing about where her favor and England's strategic alliance would eventually fall. Her single status was her greatest tool of foreign policy.
So she turned a perceived weakness, being unmarried and childless, into her greatest source of diplomatic strength and personal power.
It was a monumental personal sacrifice, maintained for nearly half a century. But this choice, this brilliant strategy, had a fatal flaw for her dynasty.
The ultimate consequence was the end of her family line.
Precisely. Without a throne heir from her body, the House of Tudor ended upon her death in 1603. This led to a moment of immense potential instability, forcing the crown onto her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. The Stuarts took over.
So her strategic spinsterhood saved her reign from internal power struggles and saved her life from potentially ambitious husbands, but it ultimately sacrificed her dynasty's long-term continuity. That is a profound, tragic political trade-off.
It really is. A personal triumph that was a dynastic failure.
Now let's shift focus, moving from 16th century England to 18th century Austria, and examine Maria Theresa. She took a completely different approach to the question of combining female identity and governance. She didn't hide her natural body, she put it to work.
Maria Theresa is fascinating because she confronts the woman problem head-on. She came to power in 1740 through a specific legal decree, the Pragmatic Sanction. It's impossible to understand her rule without understanding this document.
Right. This was her father's life's work.
It was. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, lacked a male heir, which was unthinkable for the vast multi-ethnic Habsburg lands. He spent decades persuading, coercing, and bribing the European powers to recognize this decree, which stipulated that his daughters, specifically Maria Theresa, would take priority in succession if the male candidates came from a collateral line.
So she came to power not through simple inheritance, but through decades of painstaking diplomatic and legal work by her father, designed to prevent the fragmentation of the vast Habsburg holdings.
And even with that decree, her accession was immediately challenged. Immediately. She was Queen of Hungary and Duchess of Austria, but almost right away, rivals, notably Frederick the Great of Prussia, ignored the sanction and invaded her territory of Silesia. This triggered the massive, continent-spanning war of Austrian succession.
And her critics were convinced that she was physically and politically incapable of leading an empire, especially because she was a young woman who was newly married and expected to produce heirs.
Exactly. The assumption was she couldn't possibly manage a war and a dynasty at the same time. They feared she would be too often unavailable due to pregnancy and childbirth, fundamentally undermining the stability of the state during wartime.
But she defied all of them.
She did. She ruled successfully for 40 years with immense capability. But the astounding fact of her maternal life speaks directly to the political demands placed on female rulers.
Give us the numbers again. I find them staggering.
It is truly staggering. She gave birth to 14 of her 16 children in the first 16 years of her reign.
14 children in 16 years.
Think about that pace. She was effectively pregnant or in the confinement period almost constantly throughout the early crucial years of her rule. This includes during major wars like the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War.
Yet, she seamlessly managed to combine pregnancy or the confinement period, walk in bed, with the business of governing. The sources say she had council meetings, dictated letters, and signed decrees from her birthing chamber. Her ability to multitask was, well, arguably unmatched.
The efficiency she demonstrated was breathtaking. But despite her proven effectiveness, the scrutiny never stopped. Her pregnancies were always viewed critically, creating immense political tension. Advisors worried constantly about her health, not out of personal concern necessarily, but out of fear that each new pregnancy would trigger a government crisis.
A crisis due to her potential death or temporary unavailability.
Exactly. This inherent political danger created an extraordinary set of procedures regarding royal births. This is one of the most powerful, specific details from the sources, illustrating the intense public accountability placed on her female body.
This is where things get really wild.
This is critical. Because her health was so dangerous to the stability of the entire state and the succession line, her royal births were formalized, public events. They were state functions that required witnesses.
Who specifically needed to be present? This wasn't just a closed room of doctors and midwives.
No, not at all. The list is telling and confirms the political purpose of the event. Attendees included not only medical staff and female confidants, but also all important representatives, cabinet ministers, and the political elite of the country.
They were all in the room.
They were there, not just to ensure the safety and legitimacy of the newborn heir, but to observe the state of the queen.
They were there to witness and confirm the continuity of power. Why was this witnessing required? What was the practical reason?
It was necessary so that in the absolute worst-case scenario, her death or severe health risk during childbirth, they could react immediately and swiftly. They had to prevent a governance vacuum or a constitutional crisis.
So they could act on the spot.
Yes. By having all the necessary political actors present, they ensured that the transfer of power, whether to her husband, Francis Stephen, or to a regent for her son, could be managed instantly and legitimately. This would avoid any coup or rebellion based on speculation about the queen's condition.
She effectively turned her most vulnerable, intimate, and physically demanding moments into state proceedings. She was publicly proving that the female body was not threatening the political body.
That's a perfect way to put it. She integrated the natural and the political into a single, functional, if exhausting, whole.
And she avoided any such crisis, ruling until her natural death. Her legacy is one of the most successful examples of a female monarch who explicitly integrated motherhood and monarchy, proving that critics who feared her natural body were entirely wrong about her political body's resilience.
She did her duty as a mother and her duty as a monarch simultaneously under the public gaze.
We've seen rulers who adopted male guises, rulers who leveraged intellect and charisma, rulers who fought empires for control of grain, rulers who chose strategic spinsterhood, and now rulers who defied critics by producing an army of heirs while simultaneously governing a massive European empire.
Now, we connect these historical precedents to the modern era, providing some context for how far we have truly come on the road to equality. The structures of power today are different, but the scrutiny of female leadership remains a defining factor.
While men still absolutely dominate the leadership rankings globally, we have certainly made significant progress since the 18th century. The sources point out that currently 10% of the 193 states worldwide have a female head of government or head of state.
That's nearly 20 nations being led by women at any given time.
That is progress, but it is a long way from parity. To illustrate the shift in scrutiny, the sources use Angela Merkel as the contemporary case study. She successfully served 16 years as the first chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, leading one of the most powerful economies in the world.
And Merkel's tenure, though not marked by the dramatic physical challenges of Hatshepsut or Maria Theresa, still required a very careful navigation of expectations.
Her presentation, right, her famously pragmatic, often unflashy style, the pantsuits, the no-nonsense approach, was itself a political statement. It was designed to neutralize any focus on her gender.
It was a strategy of competence over flash, much like Elizabeth III's focusing on the enduring crown over her personal body. But this brings us to the modern paradox that highlights the continued struggle even in advanced, stable democracies like Germany.
What's that contrast between the top and the broader political landscape?
You have Angela Merkel's long, stable, successful 16-year tenure, a clear sign that a woman can lead a major power with complete effectiveness and minimal crisis. Yet the sources point out that the current German Bundestag, the parliament, has fewer women than it has had in a long time.
So the highest glass ceiling is shattered, yet the foundational structure of political representation is actually receding. Why does this lack of structural progress exist despite having the ultimate role model?
Well, the analysis suggests several structural issues. One concept often discussed is the failure of voluntary political party quotas. Another is that political structures are still not conducive to women balancing political life and family life, a challenge Maria Theresa tackled, but which remains incredibly difficult without, a royal household structure.
And there's another theory mentioned.
Yes, some studies point to phenomena like the queen bee syndrome, where women who have reached the top may not actively mentor or promote other women, perhaps believing they succeeded only through personal exceptionalism rather than a supportive structure.
So even though the political environment is less existentially threatening than in Zenobia's time, and they don't face public birthing demands like Maria Theresa, the constant need for overperformance and the lack of systemic support means the path to power is still fundamentally harder.
That's the bottom line. Women in power today have it easier than their historical predecessors. They are not facing execution or demands to produce heirs to stabilize the state, but the sources are emphatic. It is still not easy. The scrutiny is different, often focusing on clothing, tone, and personal life, but it remains constant.
This ongoing journey leads us to the philosophical goal that we must consider, the quest toward true equality.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the journey is ongoing. And until the presence of a female leader is unremarkable, not a deep dive topic or just a fact of life, we haven't achieved the true goal.
And what is that goal?
It's not just numerical parity. It's a situation where equality is considered from the perspective of the equality of all people, where the discussion is about competence and policy, not presentation and gender.
The structures built around power, presentation, and succession are inherently rigid, often medieval in their origins, and they take monumental effort to change. These women show the monumental effort required.
They absolutely do.
This deep dive has shown us the immense ingenuity required of female rulers across the millennia, forcing them to adopt radical, often contradictory strategies to ensure the survival of their states and, well, themselves.
Let's briefly review these diverse strategies. We had Hatshepsut, who adopted a male identity, the ceremonial beard and the codpiece, to survive politically, sacrificing her physical identity for the state's cosmological continuity.
We analyzed Cleopatra, who utilized her intellect, her charisma, and her femininity as political tools and diplomatic leverage against overwhelming imperial power. She showed her verstand, kept her nation solvent for years.
We covered Zenobia, who chose the path of military challenge and resource control. She aimed to carve out an empire by cutting Rome off from its vital grain supply in Egypt, forcing Rome to fight for its very survival.
We looked at Elizabeth I, who chose strategic spinsterhood, the Virgin Queen, to maintain personal, undivided political power, referencing the profound political theology of the two bodies of the king.
And finally, Maria Theresa, who successfully balanced intense political and familial demands, proving that she could give birth to 14 children while running a massive European empire, but only by turning her most intimate moments into public acts of political transparency.
The final takeaway for you, the learner, is this. These women demonstrate that the challenge of female leadership has always been less about competence. There were clearly exceptional rulers, and more about navigating archaic political and social expectations regarding presentation and succession.
That's the key. They had to perform their power in ways their male counterparts simply did not.
They had to redefine what a ruler looked like, what a ruler did, and how the vulnerability of the human body could be reconciled with the permanence of the political state. Their survival hinged on their ability to manage perception.
Absolutely.
So what does this all mean? We leave you with this provocative thought, building on that incredible detail of Maria Theresa's reign.
That's a powerful one.
If her governance was dependent on having the entire political elite present at her most vulnerable moments, childbirth, to prevent a crisis, what modern political acts of transparency, sacrifice, or overperformance are still required today to ensure true confidence and non-crisis continuity for female leaders, even in the absence of a visible physical threat?
These historical figures set the bar for political performance impossibly high. Thinking about that standard forces us to examine the systems we still have in place today.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into power, politics, and the presentation of history's great female rulers.
We'll see you next time.